record on this.
There you go.
Okay,
Okay.
now it'll be a matter of me finding that file afterwards, Brad, so we'll all keep our fingers crossed, okay?
It'll pop up on your screen, but okay.
I think you're right
Nevertheless,
about that, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
I can help you,
Nevertheless,
Robin, find it.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you, Drew.
This past week, I had Philip Clayton sign off on the major portion of my dissertation, which was awesome. We met, Philip and I met yesterday via Zoom, and he asked me to construct a theology chapter next, which I'm not really in theologizing mode right now. I'm more in the scientific mode right now. But anyway, so he wants me to go back and respond to what I've done thus far, theologically, so to speak, and have some implications. I mean, it's probably a wise thing to do, but again, I'm just not in that mode of thought right now. I'm more in the strictly science. But regardless, I was invited this week to give or to submit a paper on natural theology to a journal out of Studia Elke. Where's that from? Studia Elke. Elke? Is that?
Bullet.
It's ELCKIE, right? Studia. So I mean, yeah, I think they're out of Switzerland. Does that sound like a Swiss name, Saskia? Sort of, kinda.
It's, if you gave us the right name, it might help. We could do a Google search.
Okay.
Studia
Studia-
something or other.
Studia.
I've got it right here. There's no C in it. Studio Elke.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, no. Well, I mean, that's what came up. It doesn't look like the thing you're talking about, though. So
Okay.
just go ahead. Keep going, Brad.
Oh, shucks, no. And actually, Phil wants me to integrate some of my thoughts that I've got on paper already with my chapter that I just submitted, and produce a modernized or a contemporary natural theology from that. Right. He thinks I've got the ability to do it. So I don't know. I mean, natural theology has a lot of baggage as a conceptual thought, right? And in many ways, the traditional versions of natural theology go against every grain of my being, because it tries to prove that there's a God through natural things, so to speak. But I am energized by the notion of modifying it and sort of tailoring it to my conception, so to speak. But he seems to think that I have something to proffer, so I'm going to explore that this next week and then meet with him again next week about that. But today's discussion, if you could pause the recording, Robin, and then start it back over, because I don't want to have all of this. Excellent. Today we're going to speak about Francis Galton's polyvalent and felicitous polyhedron. You'll note here that I made up a word felicitous. I based that upon the word of multiplicitous, of course, but I wanted to keep the poly in there so as to connote, but I probably should remove that I in between poly and citus. I mean, would you think that'd be apropos, Robin? Okay. But today we're going to be speaking about Francis Galton's polyhedron. Francis Galton was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, and in fact was his second cousin. You would think then that since there was close familial or quasi close familial ties, that they would be in unison mentally with one another on this issue, but they're really not. They're miles apart, so to speak. They're yards apart. Miles would be more apropos, but you get the point. Indeed. Now, Galton supported a more formalistic / structuralist view of evolution than did Darwin, who was more functionalism, right? Those are very laden words, and I could spend a whole lecture just unpacking what those terms mean. So I'm assuming some things here, right? But the most striking model and epitome for the formalist opposition to Darwin's theory derives from a source that will strike many evolutionists as paradoxical. Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Galton was a pluralist in his views on evolutionary causality. He also viewed discontinuous variation as more efficacious than simplistic gradualism. That's often a charge laid against Charles Lyell, the great geologist of the 19th century, whom was the proverbial mentor, at least. I don't know if they ever met in person or not, but I don't know the answer to that question, but I probably should find that out. But nevertheless, he was the great mentor for Charles Darwin. And in fact, Charles Darwin, his biological theories can be seen as an update of gradualism toward biological entities. Having said that, Galton viewed discontinuous variation as more efficacious than simple gradualism. Efficacious discontinuous variation, meaning that's of course regarding the variation in organisms and so forth that we now know to be genetically derived, but they just knew it was variation, that this animal looked different than that animal, and so forth like that. Discontinuous variation. He thought that was more efficacious than simple gradualism in the production of the species. Galton wrote, in fact, that evolutionary theory might dispense, quote, with the restriction for which it is difficult to see either the need or the justification, namely, that the course of evolution always proceeds by steps that are severally minute and that become effective only through accumulation. That the steps may be small and that they must be small are two very different views. It is only the latter to which I object. Galton then, Francis Galton, was thought differently than his cousin Charles Darwin, because Darwin promulgated a theory that indicated that all steps within evolution must be gradual. They must be small. They must be small. Now, Galton agrees that they could be small, but that they must be small is a totally different assertion. I'm going to quit that. Totally different assertion. It's only to the latter that I object, he says. Galton proposed his polyhedron, and we all know what a polyhedron is from math, do we not? It is at least a five-sided figure that's oblong and I guess even in a sense obtuse, but it's not ordered. It's not symmetrical, I guess you could say. Yes, it's not symmetrical would be a good way to put it. Five-sided figure, or a multi-sided figure that's not symmetrical. The one he speaks of is actually five-sided, but nevertheless, it's not symmetrical. So it's not like a hexagon, or I can't make a hexagon with my fingers, but it's not like a triangle, which has mostly three equilateral sides. It's a polygon, meaning it has different lengths on the sides and different widths and so forth like that. Galton proposed this polyhedron to explain a hierarchy of stabilities as internally generated, not externally shaped by gradual natural selection. This model of evolution by facet flipping, picture in your mind, friends, that polyhedron that I spoke of earlier, that odd-sided figure, and then each side being a facet. And when that polyhedron flips from one side to another, that is essentially a saltation, is what Galton is saying, but we'll get to that later. But this model of evolution by facet flipping, that polyhedron flipping on the side, to limit the possibilities of adjacent planes and inherited structures, stresses the two themes that are important to structuralism: channels set by internal constraint and evolutionary transition by discontinuous saltation. Saltation, by the way, if we're not familiar with that, is when we would say an evolutionary monster results, so to speak, or something that's discontinuous with the previous progenitors, or with its progenitors, I should say. The structuralists, these are both structuralist alternatives that tend to embrace these items, I should say, or structuralist alternatives, and he tended to embrace them. And he also stipulated that pure Darwinism must combat, at least, rather I should say, as challenges, the basic components of its essential logic. For channels direct the pathways of evolutionary change from the inside, albeit in potentially positive and adaptive ways, even though some external force, like natural selection, for example, may be required as an initiating impulse. Whereas saltational change violates the strict Darwinian requirement for natural selection's creativity, by vesting the scope and the direction of change in the nature and in the magnitude of internal jumps, and in sequences of adaptive accumulations mediated by natural selection at each step. So then, Galton is advocating the idea that sure, natural selection is affirmed. It really happens, Charles, so to speak. But Charles, you're wrong in saying that that's all there is to it. Because in fact, Charles, Galton would say, saltations occur and we've got to account for them somehow. So he developed this polyhedronic model. Is that yeah, polyhedronic model for affirming natural selection and saltations together. Thus, punctuational events, that is saltations, read rapid transitions between domains based upon structural properties of endpoints that actively resist change, are truly different than a pure saltational event and also a pure natural selection gradualistic event. In emphasizing sports, that's what he referred to as entities that were not expected by an evolutionary sequence of events, so to speak. They were sports. They were oddities or oddballs. They were saltationary type events in a sense. In emphasizing sports for evolutionary efficacious variation and stability for taxa at other times, Galton also became a hero of the early Mendelians, particularly for his role in formulating a general rationale for their non-Darwinian concept of saltational origin for new species by macromutation. It's interesting to look back on the history of biology, my friends. Indeed it is. The first Mendelians, and perhaps even Mendel himself, were not in line with a gradualistic evolution. They were more saltationist, meaning that evolution occurs by jerks and fits. It does not occur in a gradual sequence. It occurs by the derivation of sports, as I emphasized earlier. It was only after the modern synthesis that occurred between circa 1924 to about 1942, with the publication of G.G. Simpson's, I think it was, yeah, with his book entitled The Modern Synthesis, that Mendel's views on particulate inheritance became adopted into the mainstream of biology. It was not until then Mendelians were thought to be contrary to Darwinian evolution. They were thought to be more saltational, but the modern synthesis integrated Mendel's views on particulate inheritance, that is being particulate. We all know what that means. Inheritance, of course, by the DNA or in your genes, if you will. It was not until they incorporated that into the modern synthesis that it became aligned with Darwinism, formally conceived. Galton subsumed both non-Darwinian formalist themes of discontinuity, ineffective variation, and internally generated preferred channels of change, that is constraints, into a brilliant metaphor. This image has been largely forgotten by 20th plus century biologists, but many of Galton's contemporaries discussed the model and its implications. And of course, as I stated earlier, Galton was a contemporary of Darwin. That would have, he would have died by the turn of the 20th century. Galton would have, I'm pretty sure of saying that. But anyway, this image has been forgotten by most biologists. However, there are a few outliers. St. Georgius Mivart, that's whatever, invoked the Polyhedron as the centerpiece of the criticism that most attracted Darwin's attention and response. In fact, he was also a contemporary of Darwin and Galton. Moving forward into the next century, William Bateson, one of the founders of the modern synthesis, described Galton's metaphor as something that which may prove hereafter to be more than a metaphor. Vernon Kellogg, who wrote the documents surrounding the centennial celebration of Darwin's birth in 1909, Vernon Kellogg, speaking of Galton's familiar analogy, considered the Polyhedron as an ideal illustration for the non-Darwinian challenge of heterogenesis, that being saltationism or saltational evolution. And Hugo de Vries, also a major proponent of the modern synthesis, in his book entitled Mutation Theory, even he stated that Galton's Polyhedron expressed his own view of variation in a very beautiful way, end quote. Francis Galton introduced the metaphor of the Polyhedron in probably his most influential book, that being Hereditary Genius. Galton therein writes, in discussing the stability of types, this is where I want you to make key note of here. Galton is talking about the stability of types, and the types being, of course, what we would refer to as probably phylum today. Yeah, phylum. But regardless, Francis Galton wrote in his book, Hereditary Genius, the following: the mechanical conception would be that of a rough stone, having in consequence of its roughness a vast number of natural facets, on any one of which it may rest in a stable equilibrium. That is to say, when pushed, it would totter, of course. I mean, you can see this in your mind by looking at a triangle. And that's not a polyhedron, but it's something we can all think of. When you push a triangle, it may totter, but it takes a hell of a force to make it flip over to another side. Does that make sense at all? Whereas it can totter back and forth, but again, it takes a massive force to make it shift from AB to, say, CD, for example, sides, and we're all familiar with that. But nevertheless, that is to say, again, Galton says, when pushed, it would somewhat yield. When pushed much harder, it would again yield, but in a less degree. In either case, on the pressure being withdrawn, it would fall back to its natural position. As in the triangle I just made mention of there, it would fall back to its natural position. But if by a powerful effort, the stone is compelled to overpass the limits of the facet on which it hitherto found rest, it will tumble over into a new position of stability. Like this bottom triangle here is AB. This is like what You get the idea, right? It switched from, say, AB to CD, right? A, B, C, D sides of the triangle. ABC, rather, of the triangle. Anyway, yeah, I'm messing this up now. But no, on the pressure being withdrawn, it will fall back into its first position. But if by powerful effort, the stone is compelled to overpass the limits of the facet on which it hitherto found rest, it will tumble over into a new position of stability, whence just the same proceedings must be gone through as before it can be dislodged and rolled on another step upwards or onwards. The various positions of stable equilibrium may be looked upon as so many typical attitudes of the stone, the type being more durable as the limits of the stability are wider. We also see clearly that there is no violation of the law of continuity in the movements of the stone, though it can only repose, that is, become stable, I guess you could say, in certain widely separated places. About 20 years later, after his first title in Natural Inheritance, Galton's metaphor for the polyhedron that we just spoke of there moved from an afterthought in the back of a book to the focal point of an early chapter on organic stability. Galton therein granted his polyhedronical image in abstract and formal geometry. He writes, this polyhedron is a polygonal slab that can be made to stand on any one of its edges when set upon a level table. The model and organic structure have the cardinal fact in common that if either is disturbed without transgressing the reign of stability, it will tend to reestablish itself, that is, revert back to the position it had. But if the range is overpassed, it will topple over into a new position. Again, view that triangle. If the range of stability is overpassed, it'll topple over into a new position of stability. Although a long established race, he writes, habitually breeds true to its kind, subject to small unstable deviations, yet every now and then the offspring of these deviations do not tend to revert, but possess some small stability of their own. They therefore have the character of subtypes, always, however, with a reserved tendency under strained conditions to revert to the earlier type. So the facet could be flipped back because they could revert back to the earlier type. These sports could. The model further illustrates the fact that sometimes a sport may occur of such marked peculiarity and stability as to rank as a new type, phylum, capable of becoming an origin of a new race with very little assistance on the part of natural selection. When the slab rests on the edge AB, it stands in its most stable position. So long as it's merely tilted back and forth, it will fall back, being left alone. And its position when merely tilted corresponds to a simple deviation. But when it's pushed with sufficient force, it will tumble onto the next edge, BC, into a new position of stability. It will rest there, but less stably so, or less securely so, than the first position. Moreover, its range of stability will no longer be disposed symmetrically. A comparatively slight push from the front will suffice to make it tumble back. That triangle tumbling back. If, however, the slab is at length brought to rest on edge CD, which is the third edge, the next onward push, which may be very slight, will suffice to topple it over into an entirely new system of stability. In other words, the sport comes suddenly into existence. The facet flipping there of the polyhedron. That's a metaphor, of course. He's going to flesh it out later, but that's just a metaphor of the saltation events, the facet flipping of the polyhedron. In a later article on discontinuity and evolution, Galton strongly asserts that most evolutionary novelty, in opposition to his cousin Darwin, probably arises per saltum. That means by saltation. Many, if not most, he writes, breeds have their origins in sports. Not in playing ball, but I mean sports in the sense of being saltatory events. Galton bases his rationale on the argument that continuous small-scale Darwinian variability, although omnipresent, cannot be effective because regression toward the mean precludes accumulation in favored directions. Again, let me unpack that sentence there. Let's think of something. Let's think of a thought of experiment here. If you have 10 Caucasians, strictly Caucasian, say from Germany, 10 Africans from Nigeria, and then five Indians from India, right? And they all start breeding together, right? They all start breeding together. What color do you think the end product will be? Will they be black or will they be white? No, they're going to be closer to the olive complexion. It's a regression toward the mean. Do you follow what I mean by that? It's a regression toward the mean. So Galton says that in Darwinian populations, if populations do in fact act as Darwin himself claimed, regression toward the mean would always occur, and nothing new would arise. It takes saltatory events, Galton proclaims, in order for a sport to arise that is significantly different from its progenitors, that it can then pass genetically onward to its own progenitors. This is the distinctives of its phenotype, and hence its genotype. Again, Galton bases his rationale on the argument that continuous small-scale Darwinian variability, though omnipresent, would preclude significant accumulation because it would tend to regress toward the mean. In the example that I gave you, the 10 white, 10 black, and the 10 Indian people, or the net result of that would sort of mix into a olive skin complexion. It would regress toward the mean. It wouldn't go to either side usually. And of course, I could get into the genetics of that, but I mean, that's not always apropos, but just for illustration's sake, it works. Galton introduced the term transilience, that is a literal going between, to describe his favorite concept of non-Darwinian saltatory variation or facet flipping. He writes, "No variation can establish itself unless it be the character of a sport, that is, by a leap from one position of organic stability to another, or as we may phrase it, through transilient variation." That term never caught on, but anyway, if there be no such leap, the variation is, so to speak, a mere blend or divergence from the parent form. Again, 10 black, 10 white, 10 Indians. It's going to, generally speaking, they're going to meld together and become olive skin complected. It tends to regress. It may therefore be called a divergent variation. I am unable to conceive the possibility, this is a key statement, I am unable to conceive the possibility of evolutionary progress except by transiliences, that is, the going between or saltatory events. For if they were merely divergences, each subsequent generation would tend to regress backwards toward the typical center. I hope that makes sense there. I've belabored that point a little bit. Galton also writes in that same paper the following: by what steps did A change into B, generic A into generic B? Was it necessarily through the accumulation of a long succession of alterations, individually so small as to almost be imperceptible, though large and conspicuous in the aggregate? Or could there have ever been abrupt changes? That's his question. It's a leading question on his part. Of course, he's wanting his reader to think, well, yeah, there could be abrupt changes. Why? Because it's almost nonsensical to think that these minute changes over an entire population can accumulate in piecemeal in order to produce a new species, because populations tend to regress toward the mean and not vary flagrantly, I guess you could say. Acknowledging the criterion of relative frequency for resolving debates in natural history, Galton, correctly in my opinion, notes that Darwin did catalog exceptions, but only to log their peripheral character and to assert the domination of gradualistic accretion by natural selection leading to adaptation. Galton writes, notwithstanding the multitude of striking cases of the above description collected by Darwin, the most marked impression left on the mind by the sum of all of his investigations was the paramount effect of the accumulation of a succession of petty differences through the influence of natural selection. That's an important statement there. Galton refers to Darwin's mechanism as petty. Why? Because the variations that Darwin posited were small, minute, almost insensible, but they accumulate over time. Okay, well, Galton says no, that's petty differences, and it would revert to the mean, not producing any new organisms or new entities. This idea is certainly prevalent, he writes further, among his successors at the present day, with the correlation that the evolution of races and species has always been an enormously protracted process. I myself, not me, Bradford, but him, I have myself written many times during the last few years in an opposite sense to this, end quote. In summary of the contentions regarding the polyhedron of Galton, we may say that the polyhedron embodies four major implications that assert and codify the power of formalist constraint as an important evolutionary agent of change and not merely an impediment, while controverting the essential Darwinian claim that natural selection alone builds new forms in a creative and accumulative fashion. First, occasional large variations, that is, sports, are important for evolution. They're far more important, I should say, for evolution than omnipresent, normally distributed small variation in population sizes. This substitution of big for small forces a major compromise and may even present a fatal weakness in Darwin's theory of natural selection. Think about that, guys. I mean, if small, minute changes merely wash out with each other and regress to the mean, what then of natural selection? Because natural selection is built upon the premise of slowly accumulative gradual change over an immensity of time. Well, see, we in the 20th century, I'm getting off here a little bit. We in the 20th century have put a definite time frame on the availability for evolution to occur. We did this, of course, by in physics, by stipulating the Big Bang, and by giving dates for the concretion of Earth, giving dates for the beginning of life as we know it, the beginning of microbial life, etc. We've given dates for these, and the time is just not there. The time is just not there for a gradual sequence of petty differences to accumulate, to use Galton's terminology. Indeed, Galton writes, it is shown by Mr. Darwin in his great theory of the origin of species that all organic forms of life are in some sense controvertible or some sense convertible into one another. For all have, according to his views, sprung from common ancestry. Yet the changes are not by insensible gradations, I should say. They are many, but not an infinite number of intermediate links. How is the law of continuity to be satisfied by a series of jerks? Second, for Galton, internal factors establish a hierarchy of stabilities, discontinuous in origin, and explaining different degrees of divergence among typical forms, phyla. Galton proposed his polyhedron to explain the hierarchy of stabilities as internally generated, not externally shaped by gradual natural selection. Galton presumably purposely shaped his model to encompass both small islands of stability within species, that is subtypes in his terms, and also to cover the origin of new taxa or phyla that cannot revert across different facets of the polyhedron. Okay, so all of this heretofore has just been one long extended metaphor with the polyhedron, flipping, facet flipping, etc. Third, for Galton, the positions of stability for both subtypes and types are not honed by natural selection, but are internally preset as rare configurations of coherence among parts. Talk about slap your cousin in the face. I mean, come on now. My word. Yeah. They're not honed by natural selection. Galton is proposing that these internal channels are, well, in Laban's terms, Platonic forms, if you will. So they're not honed by natural selection, but they're internally preset as rare configurations of coherence among parts. The causal basis of stable form must therefore be explained by internal integrity, not by only adaptation. He grants that adaptation does occur. He heralds Darwin for the discovery of natural selection, but he says that's not enough. That's not enough. There must be formal constraint and so forth as well. To illustrate this point, Galton proposed an internal basis from morphological stability. He writes, "It is easy to form a general idea of the conditions of stable equilibrium in the inorganic world, where one element is so correlated with another that there must be an enormous number of unstable combinations for each that is capable of maintaining itself unchanged generation after generation." In other words, I'm going to skip that. As the fourth theme in Galton's polyhedronical model, the polyhedron also highlights the theme of internally based directionality, not only of discontinuous change. Merely a status as a provider of an impetus of change scarcely fulfills Darwin's requirements for selection's power and scope. In a metaphor for illustrating pure Darwinisms, organisms may be represented as billiard balls with natural selection as the pool cue. A perfectly round ball denotes Darwinian isotropic variation. Isotropic meaning variable on all sides, no preferred direction. It's isotropic. It's all sides. It goes everywhere, in other words. A perfectly round ball, again, denotes Darwinian isotropic variation. The organism only supplies the raw material and it cannot set its own direction of change. In this model, the ball's trajectory depends upon the pull cue of natural selection, and the ball rolls with no internal control over its own direction of motion. But Galton's polyhedronical model also pushes back. Key point. Absent an impetus, right? The polyhedron cannot tumble at all. And the impetus here is, of course, natural selection. He grants that. But the pusher, that is natural selection, doesn't set the direction of motion. The direction of tumbling instead will be determined as much by the internal structure of the polyhedron as by the strength of the impetus, that being natural selection in this case. Only certain internally established channels of change can be realized, even if natural selection always initiates the tumbling of the polyhedron. In this sense, Galton's polyhedron weds the theme of directionality with the idea of discontinuity. This is where Gould comes in. So then, Stephen Jay Gould, that is. So then, in terms of Galton's polyhedron, the proverbial cue stick of natural selection may do all the actual pushing, but if internal channels, that is those set by history, and thereafter grafted into the genetic and developmental pathway of current organisms, designate a limited set of possible pathways as conduits for selection's pushing, then these internal constraints can assuredly claim equal weight with natural selection in a full account of the causes of any particular evolutionary change. That's the key point. Stephen Jay Gould, who I write about in my dissertation, of course, he seizes upon this and says, yes, you're right. On this polyhedronical model, Francis Galton, talking to him, separated by probably 100 years or more, anyway, says, yeah, you're right, Galton. The natural selection is a pool cue that gets the thing started. But the direction the balls actually go in is determined by internal channels, internal constraints. Galton concludes the treatment of the polyhedronical formulation in discontinuity and evolution with the formalist flourish. I quote, I therefore insisted that the continual appearance of these well-marked and very distinct patterns prove the reality of the alleged positions of organic stability, and that the latter were competent to mold races without any help whatever from the process of selection, whether natural or sexual. In his hereditary genius, Galton also highlights the polyhedron's theme of internally based directionality, that is the channeling of constraint, not only of discontinuous change. Galton stated that his model did not deny continuity and change, but only confuted the insensible character of the transitions. Again, he does not deny that natural selection has potency and power. Rather, he denies that natural selection works with insensible gradations over a gradualistic period of time. I hope that makes sense. Insensible gradations, so to speak, because those would revert back to the mean, that being, aka somewhat similar anyway. It's different mathematically, but the average, so to speak. Galton's conception of change does grant a role to natural selection. Some force has to push the polyhedron, which apparently natural selection provides. Formalism indeed boasts a long and distinguished pedigree, well antedating both Darwin and any explicit discussion of evolution. While Darwinism rendered many formalist concerns irrelevant, key features of the structuralist agenda could not be encompassed therein, or even well addressed by such a theory of natural selection and its functionalist mechanics. Galton's polyhedron provides a strikingly apt metaphor for two great themes of formalism that continue to demand attention even in the 21st century. And that the Darwinism of his day could not adequately comprehend. For example, these formalist themes of discontinuous evolution and internally generated pathways. In other words, saltations and channels. Both of these themes express the more general conception that internal properties of organisms push back against external natural selection, thereby rendering evolution as a dialectical inside and out, that organisms, in other words, must be conceived as polyhedrons in his metaphor. Shifting back to Gould quickly, I put John to sleep, but shifting back to Gould quickly, he contends that formalist structuralist evolutionary thought from the immediate post-Darwinian years to the codification of the modern synthesis in the 1930s continued to emphasize the twin concepts of saltation and channels. For these notions represent two sides of the same conviction that internal structure can set and constrain the pathway of change. The modern plea in the final flurry here to put history and organic integrity back into the evolutionary theory echoes the same call. If constraint has become a buzzword of contemporary evolutionary theory in the 21st century, then Galton and Jeffrey are smiling. I didn't mention Jeffrey, but he was another formalist. He got excised out of this portion here, but regardless, for the structure of their thought, it's withstood the formalist ultimate test of timelessness. Again, to reiterate, Galton's key premise is that the gradualism presupposed and advocated by Charles Darwin is incapable of producing new kinds of organisms, new types of organisms, new phyla, new taxa, you could say, because all changes revert to the mean. They revert to the mean, whereas it takes genuine saltations, genuine saltatory events, genuine sports to occur in order for evolution to proceed by natural selection. Thank you for your time.
Brad, I have to tell you with utter sincerity, that was a fabulous piece of writing. And I'm not, you're always telling me that I'm just like puffing you up, but I am not puffing you up, and I have a lot to say to you about it, but I'm not going to go first. As the leader.
I will say this, Brad, you're a very clear writer. You use
God, so good.
except for your technical terminology, which comes out in this paper and other papers, because throwing out a technical term like you do without defining it creates ambiguity for the listener. They don't know what you're talking about, essentially.
Well,
Right.
but
I'm sorry.
But otherwise,
as a defense here, this is a portion of a chapter that I just excised out and tried to make it make sense, right? So earlier I do define those terms in previous paragraphs, of course, but today's topic was on Galton's polyhedron. So I think I did indicate that perhaps I assume that my reader understands these ideas because they read through the preceding portions of the paper, so to speak.
Right.
But I grant your point, though, John.
But I will say, well, you did that in part because you were trying to cut your paper down to a reasonable length. And I thought this was like perfect length, especially given the complications of the paper. I don't think because except for Joseph, though I don't want to speak for everybody, I think we're not really of scientific backgrounds, but I have learned so much from your science papers, Brad, and this one perhaps more than any others. But about what John said, I just want to jump in here and say that I think what you do is when you present to us, you tend to stop. Well, you know that you do this. You give us a compact piece of writing, and then where you think we might need a little bit more explanation to follow you, you stop and you just give it to us spontaneously. And that works for me. Because I do try to transcribe. I try to transcribe. I'm sure I got only a tiny part of it, but if you say something that's not in the paper, I try to write it down if I catch that. And so I've done that all the way through your paper this time. And you're basically trying to do what John is saying you're lacking here, except and this is still not me taking my turn. I'm still responding to what John said here. What struck me as I was listening to you today is what a good teacher you are, because it is true that a lot of this stuff, because most of us don't have science backgrounds, goes over our head because of the terminology, but you have such a giftedness for creating metaphor, for pointing out the metaphors, as you yourself said, in what you're talking about, and for sort of creating metaphorical illustrations of the stuff you're talking about. So even though I'm not a math science person, there's not math in here, so that shouldn't be a problem, but I really could, because I'm a smart person, just not with that training, I could really follow what you're saying, and it just filled my head with visions of you being that next Stephen Jay Gould, who's writing not just for academic science, but you're writing with integrity, with the integrity of academic science, and with that background, that knowledge, but you're writing also for people who don't have that background, and you're narrating a story. That's what I was trying to tell you the other day when I saw you. You narrate, and that's what makes what you're doing so powerful to me. So,
Thank you.
So may I just ask if anybody else would like to jump in here? Well, either Jeremy or Joseph, and give Brad a few comments.
Well, go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, I didn't have much to say. I know this is going to titillate Brad. I'm a Christian theist, so I don't hold to a view of evolution like some do, but there is an opening for theistic evolution. So I stepped back in a broader sense, and I thought, okay, how does Galton, Gould, some of these evolutionists, because I did a lot of study on this many years ago, like 15, and I kind of let that go because I'm focused on my graduate work. But what it does is it makes me step back thinking about, okay, what did I learn before? What do I don't know? Who are these? Who's Galton? Okay, eugenics. So I had to do a little background. So for me, it's not into specifics of your work as much as it is me putting it together in my web of what I believe and don't believe, and how it fits, and how I could push against, like what tension points it could cause. So for me, it was just general, but it was technical. So I can't just be like, jump in there and be like, oh yeah, I understand exactly what you're doing, because I don't. That's like if I was to bring somebody into my highly technical piece of work, whatever, that I spent time on, if they're not familiar with the field, they'd be like, what? It's like that, which is good. But I thought you did a good presentation. So I don't have much to give you as far as substantial criticism of your work, just what it made me think about in my own view.
Thank you for your comments, Joseph.
Yeah.
Or Dr. Komrosky, I should say.
Oh my gosh, I forgot.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, no, and you presented good when you gave side stories and all like that. I thought that was good. And what it made me think about, Brad, is that I should have gave you guys my damn dissertation so that you could have read it, and I didn't. So I wondered what you guys must be thinking, like, shit. So when the other lady, I forget her name, she said she read my dissertation, I'm like, how'd she read it? I don't remember emailing it out unless she got it on ProQuest.
The other lady, is that Sophia?
Yeah. Oh no, the one who just left this meeting.
Oh, Saskia. No, I think she meant that she read my email that just gave the little, explanation of what you did. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I don't know, it just made me think what Brad was doing, because I haven't been in the club for a while. I don't know if everybody emails out their stuff, and I didn't. So I thought maybe that would have been better.
Well, I mean, I don't want to speak for anybody else. I can only speak for myself. I personally don't have time to read anybody's work, and that I've set aside this you know, whatever it is that we spend between 1 and 3 hours every Friday. And I absolutely give my whole to it. I mean, like, there is nothing else
Mm.
on my screen, my internal screen, when somebody is reading, to the best of my ability, which is why I drink coffee. But but anyway, if you, I know this is not true for everybody, but if you sent me your dissertation or a 10-pager, I would not read it before your presentation, because I am overwhelmed with my own work, and I just don't have the time to do it right now, which is why Brad and I had a wonderful little spat over email this week, in which he sent me this paper, which I didn't actually know to be the thing he was going to read today. And instead of giving me a blurb for his, you know, a blurb, like I always ask you guys to do. And I'm trying to think of a Southern term, Brad. I whooped your ass. The one thing the one thing you didn't do was say, yes, you didn't ma'am me, which is probably because I actually did whoop your ass. But I forced Brad to pull, you know, to take to come up with 3 sentences that described what he was going to do. And you texted them to me, and they were perfecto, you know, perfectissimo. And they were a great rundown of what you were doing here. But what I said to you was, Brad, I do not have time to read your paper and come up with a blurb, and you have to do it. That's all I'm saying, Joseph. Not that I wouldn't love to read your dissertation, but I wouldn't even have time to read my own child's dissertation right now.
On the contrary to Miss Robin, I actually do read the stuff that's sent out. Ordinarily, Joseph, what we do is you're on the schedule for presentation that Friday, or say on next Friday. I'm making this up, you know, of course, right? So by next Wednesday, you would send Robin a small snippet of what you're working on, and then when people do attach things, when Robin says, well, I do look them over. Not
so I should have sent your thing, Brad, because you're right. There are some of us who do read it ahead of time. So I'm only speaking for myself, Joseph.
Yeah, and another thing I want to say to Bradford is, when you talk about natural arguments for the existence of God, I was going to say, when I went to seminary, one thing I learned is that no arguments, whether it's the Kalam cosmological, teleological, ontological, moral, there's a bunch. There's even one called nuological, argument for God due to the existence of consciousness. The collective view that I got from some of the philosophy professors at Talbot is that none of the arguments are absolutely convincing. Cumulatively, they might weigh in with somebody, and they might say, okay, I understand. I'm pushed to, you know, lean towards the existence of the God because of these, but no one of them is a landslide. And so I come from that view, is that, you know, the arguments themselves, they can persuade, but there's no like, hey, here's my argument. And you're like, wow, I'm an atheist now, or I'm a theist. I don't think they work.
Right.
Plantinga would even say, because he's not an evidentialist, he would say, well, these arguments for the existence of God, he's not really into that. But what he would say is that if theism were true, and if God exists, which he certainly believes, he would say, well, that's a proof that's very consistent with Christian thinking. That's what he would do. But I'm more of an evidentialist, so I don't lean towards Plantinga. But I say all this because I step back now and I think, okay, how does one's rational attitude get affected by an argument that Brad, you know, gave us today, as far as if you're an evolutionist or non-evolutionist or whatever. So then I think of the famous case of Anthony Flew, who was fully an atheist, and then he became a theist. And there's one argument that got him, and he admits it. It's the teleological argument. That has odds with the evolutionary argument. So now it makes me step back and think about, all right, because I'll be thinking about this because I'm analytical, and I wish I wasn't, but I'll be thinking about Galton and more about him. And now, you know, figuring out he was the father of eugenics, which I didn't know. I was just trying to do background while Brad was reading. So I kind of step back and I think, how do these arguments play an effect towards one's rational attitude? For me, I'm already convinced in what I believe. but now I look at the role that arguments play. So anyways, I'll factor Galton in there and Gould. I remember Gould from previous classes, but I know it's a long-winded way, but I agree with Brad that if you're going to use a natural argument, which is against odds with the divine command argument, and which is fascinating to look at those two, I'm in agreement that none of these arguments is entirely convincing, but cumulatively they might be. And that goes for the evolutionists pushing back against the theist.
Well, see,
Uh,
I'm a full-fledged, if you don't know this about me, Joseph, I'm a full-fledged ardent. I mean, I used to sniff the buttocks of Charles Darwin's decaying corpse.
Okay.
Right.
So,
I mean, you know,
okay. So you're an
that's,
atheist.
that's how far,
evolutionist.
that's how far my nose is into it.
Okay. That's a
Right.
good analogy. I got it. That was clear.
Yeah. Right. But I'm also a theist, and I think the two can be accommodated to one another.
So
If
wait. Oh, I was
done
going to
in
say you're an
respect-
atheist, but you're a theist.
I'm a theist, yeah.
Oh, so, okay. Do you believe in theistic evolution? If I were to just take a quick guess.
I'm a I don't like the term because I don't like the term because it's all laden with, you know, with various I believe in evolution. Let me see. Just like the church teaches that that Jesus was fully God and fully human, so too am I, fully an evolutionist and fully a Christian.
Okay. Yeah. No, and I mean it in the most general possible
Yeah.
sense. There's a guy in LA, Hugh Ross. He's a Christian theist, and he also believes fully in evolution. And he's at odds with certain members of the church. He doesn't, but I'm just saying he has a view that if you haven't heard of him, you might be like, oh, basically God could use evolution.
I'm aware of Hugh Ross. Yeah, right. I am.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
didn't know he was in LA, but I'm aware of him.
Or he was years ago. I think he is. Okay.
Jeremy, I'm waiting with anticipation for your critical words, man.
You know, Brad, it's never personal, ever.
Okay.
And I mean that. I don't
Yeah.
function that way. No, actually, Brad, I just wanted to also, check the mark by what Robin said. So I appreciate the moments where you stop, and give us some background,
Yeah.
because that's helpful, because I don't have a technical knowledge of this area either. My question is just, so I have a comment, although it's more directed towards Joseph, because I'm not sure that Flew became a theist. I think he stopped being an atheist, and
I
I think
agree with you.
I think there might be a difference there.
I agree with you.
Proof. I have proof.
But anyways, we can discuss that in a later day. I don't, I wouldn't claim to be a theist, I think, is where I'm trying to locate myself in this conversation. So, but Brad, I'm wondering, what is it, with this kind of provocative presentation and provocative paper, what do you think are some of the reasons that, this perspective just, I don't want to say hasn't won the day, right? Because that kind of treats it like a zero-sum game. But what is it about this work that just didn't get the traction, that you think, maybe other work did? Because I don't know that story. So you kind of talked about in the early 1920s that there was a moment where a particular model became the dominant model.
Yeah,
And so, can you say something about, and if you can't, it's fine, I'm just curious, about that moment, but more specifically how it relates to, how you think, why that occurred, and what this kind of, conversation is going to uncover. Is this a view that can add to that? Is it a view that needs to change it radically? Like the 1920s were just a mistake. We shouldn't have adopted the view that we did. Can you say something to that effect? Because I think that would be very
Okay.
helpful for me.
Okay, sure. Well, we need to understand that Darwin, of course, proposed his theory of natural selection, actually beginning in 1844 in an unpublished paper, but formally in 1859. All throughout the latter part of the 19th century, there was a tug of war between teleologists and dysteleologists. if you will, to put it in a sense. This teleologist. Okay, well, generally speaking, Asa Gray is an exception to this, but generally speaking, most teleologists did not like Darwin. But Asa Gray, one of Darwin's good friends, was a bona fide theist, and he adored Darwin's theory of evolution. And he said that this opens, I can't quote him exactly right now, but this is a grander view of God working through secondary causality than doing it by divine fiat, right? Okay, well, back to your question at hand, though, Jeremy. In the late 19th century, there were battles for orthodoxy, so to speak, battles for orthodoxy in Darwinism. Some early Darwinists, after Darwin promulgated his theory in 1859, thought, okay, this mechanism has verity, but it's not all that it could be. Others thought that no, that species just kind of pop up, if you will. Okay. A pure saltationist would say, well, the species just kind of pop up. They just occur. It's just an abnormality, and they pop out, so to speak, like the little, what's that game that's called? When you hit the little thing on the
Whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole, right. Like a little mole that shoots up, right? That's what a species does. It just kind of shoots up and you whack it down, so to speak. But anyway, yeah. So your original question, I'm getting lost in the minutia of my weeds, so to speak here, but I'm trying to figure out how I can formulate this answer to this question in the best way. There were multiple sides. Some thought, of course, Gregor Mendel was a Catholic monk, and he discovered genetics in the mid 1850s. Okay, but it was suppressed. It was not. He was at not a nunnery, but at a monastery. Thank you, monastery, and that it was suppressed. That genetical work was suppressed. That was back in the day when most religionists were ardent scientists as well. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But this is a little aside. Regardless, he discovered his particulate theory of inheritance, that being gene-based inheritance, just to put it, I guess, bluntly. He did this on pea plants, exactly. Now, originally, that side of the faction that thought that sports just popped up like whack-a-mole latched on to Mendel's theory and said, oh, yeah, there's proof that it just happens automatically. It just happens, bing, bam, it happens, right? And Orthodox Darwinians were for quite some time, probably almost a generation, struggling with how to integrate Mendelian genetics into. They acceded that Mendel's theory was correct, but they couldn't figure out how to put it together with the natural selection. Well, the modern synthesis occurred, like I said, over in the early 1924, something like that, through 1942, all throughout the 30s. This is when a great number of biologists came together in formal meetings, for example. They wrote separate treatises, but they came together, of course, for meetings and so forth. And they devised a plan, and they devised a methodology, a manner in which they could integrate Mendelian genetics inside of a neo-Darwinian, or actually inside of a Darwinian framework of natural selection. And that became known as the modern synthesis. And frankly, that's still what's taught. That became the predominant viewpoint, so to speak. And that also became textbook viewpoints. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's what you learned in textbooks in high school, for example. Maybe even in college. And in fact, it's still predominant today, right? The neo-Darwinian model of gene flow changes very inartfully, inoften, so to speak, or unoften, whatever. But nevertheless, and the gene flow changes, and that gives rise to variation, which then is expressed in my brother who has the full head of hair that's blonde and is pretty more stocky than I am, so to speak, right? Whereas I am, a bald guy, what have you, with a diminutive figure, and so forth like that. I'm a very small man, small and petty in many ways, but no, sincerely, yeah, that natural variation was harnessed by the modern synthesis into a genetical theory of natural selection. That became textbook, I guess, truth, so to speak, and that's what the next generation learned. So it was suppressed, not actively, but it was suppressed by I'm not there kind of a thing. Does that make sense? I mean, it wasn't taught, so therefore it wasn't perpetuated, and therefore it's just seemingly lost in history, so to speak. But I shouldn't say lost in history. There's always been an undercurrent of formalist thinking in biology, but it's been very minute. Does that at all even address part of your question, Jeremy?
Yeah, that's helpful, especially the kind of the last piece about how the undercurrent, right? Because I think that's true in a lot of fields, right? There's the undercurrent, and I just think that's an interesting phenomenon, especially in the natural sciences, because in the natural sciences, I think my perception of it is, that it's just kind of, it is what it is, right? And
right.
there's not like I mean, I know that that's not true, but it's just it's interesting way in
That's the
which,
common perception, though, right?
right, the way it's portrayed, and very similar
All
to that,
facts, man. Just give me the facts, man. Just give me the facts.
right? And in physics, we still teach Einstein for some reason, or not Einstein, Newton, right?
Newton.
We teach Newtonian physics first, but we hardly use that,
Right.
like in a outside the kind of high school setting. So no, that's great. I just was curious about that. And the other bit that really intrigued me was your kind of passing comment about we know how long ago, when the Big Bang, that kind of, like, we have the ability to measure those kinds of things, and yet that's not enough time to accomplish the thing that you're talking about. So you don't need to unpack that now. I'm just noting that intrigued me.
That intrigued
Me too.
And because I assume that the physics, the mathematics of the physics is true.
Right.
I don't really doubt that that's when the Big Bang occurred. That seems pretty, because we could how the speed of light and all those kinds of things. But it's interesting. That's very provocative. Your thesis, your comment about, even that's not enough time to accomplish. So, anyways, I just thought that was an interesting way into the conversation.
Me too.
So, thank you.
Totally agree with that. Totally agree.
Right. I mean, I do not offer what's known as a typical theistic evolutionary I guess program or what have you, or precept even, but I do offer a teleologically driven evolutionary process. And the way I do this is, of course, I've presented on this before in the past, that God enters into the natural world by what process, guys and gals? Kenosis.
Oh, okay. I was going to say amor potente, but
that's all connected as well. Amor potente love. Yes, ma'am, you're right. The more potente love causes God to share himself with the natural world, in so much as that onsets a panentheistic relationship where God is all in the world is all in God, but God is more than the world at the same time. If that makes sense?
So
Yeah, now
Brad,
you're talking about stuff that we can actually discuss with you.
well,
Brad, I think.
yeah, and just
Yeah.
a follow-up, Brad. So why is that important? So, you know, I am nominally religious at this point. I mean, I'm Episcopalian, so
Yeah.
hardly religious, right? Um, I guess I'm not concerned about God. So, and hearing your presentation today, and considering your thoughtful, engaged, and for me, that's enough. I don't need to have a kind of theistic overlay or a theistic intersection. So tell me why for you that's there. That I think that's the kind of question I'm trying to get at.
And also Phil told you to do it, but you've been leaving it out of your papers. And I guess I too want to know, are you going to bring it back in just for Phil, or is it really there for you?
Am I going to do what again?
Just what Jeremy's saying. Are you going to really go back and bring theology into what you're doing when you just, because Phil is telling you to, or, is it like what Jeremy said? Why? Because you've been over the last months of this year.
Mhm.
Yeah, this year is when it's been, because that first presentation you did for us was your Amor Potente, and then you did a little more theology and a little more, but then it gradually trailed off into what you're doing now. And as a strictly, like, not talking about your dissertation, not even caring in this moment about the fact that you have to finish a dissertation in a process theology program. I would say, as a writing mentor, which is what I've been for the last 30 years, what you're doing has a lot of self-empowerment and drivenness. And I want to know too how and why you're going to reestablish theology in it, and if you really are convinced that you need that.
Actually, I am convinced I need that, only because the sciences as I know them, and I've studied them for what, 24 years, 25 years, whatever. It's 2021, yeah, 26 years, what have you. But anyway, the sciences as I know them only go to some certain point. They cannot explain all things. I mean, of course, they can describe things, but they can't explain them. If you can make that distinction there at all in your mind. Okay, well, I think that the theological task of today is conversing very fluently with science. And in order to converse with science, you must go deep into science. I mean, I hate it when these little highfalutin charlatans is the way I put it.
I call them used car dealers, but charlatans is
Okay, right. When they try to say, well, science proves this and science proves that, and well, I'm going to tell you what the Bible says. Come on, right? Or even when you've got these major pastors and preachers writing books on theology and science, when they don't know a damn thing about science. They don't know a damn thing about science. So I'm working from the bottom up here. I'm not a top-down thinker. I'm not a overarching kind of a idea thinker. I'm working from the bottom up. I'm a bottom-up thinker. So I'm working from the bottom up through the sciences, going toward a transcendent realm. Does that at all?
That makes sense to me. That's what I see you doing, Bradford.
Okay.
I have a couple questions for you, or when it's my turn.
it's your turn, John.
Be done soon. Why?
Because I want to play with
I
Okay.
I think both these views seem to me, both these two models for the evolutionary paradigm seem to have problems, and that neither can explain how it happened. They hope they can explain, and they're striving for an explanation. But the large number of evolution, this is a question prefaced by some comments, feel that you need millions and millions of years and billions of years to make evolution happen. So then the question arises, this other model by Galton and also by Stephen Gould is postulating the lack of need for even millions of years.
No. The Earth is at least 4.6 billion years old. We know this. Now, of course, the universe before the Earth is probably 18 trillion years old, right? Well, but the Earth is 4.6, and we can derive that figure mathematically by using today's events working backwards. Does that make sense? I mean, that's the whole premise of science. When you observe things today and then you work backwards, you extrapolate backwards.
Well, I'm not questioning that right now, but the general theory of naturalistic evolution that's Darwin's theory needs a lot of time.
Yes.
And it
but, just a second here.
Go ahead.
The Earth is 4.6 billion years old, but it's probably only been habitable, because of molten structure, the proximity to the sun, and so on and so forth, ad nauseum, all other qualifiers. It's only been habitable probably for about 75, 80 million years, which is what, 5 billion divided, or let's just say 50 million years divided by 5 billion is what, is that 1/10? Somebody did the math for me real quick. Yeah.
Well,
Brad, we're philosophers and theologians. We don't do math.
Oh no, but it's only a tenth of the roughly only a tenth of the history of the Earth has been habitable, and you'll note that almost along that, almost right at the time it became habitable, you've got life springing up, right? Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
But
getting back
what
to
I'm saying is that the habitable periods of time are not long enough for the gradualistic, step-by-step, piecemeal evolutionary process posited by natural selection. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Which poses a big evolution that's most popular. But I would think that Richard Dawkins would try to have a response to, because basically you're saying it can't happen the way you say it happens, Richard.
No, I'm not saying that at all. Richard Dawkins doesn't advocate the massive amount of time that Darwin did. Dawkins, if you don't believe some rumors, has come to the conclusion of panspermia. Do you know what panspermia is?
That it seeded from outer space.
Bingo.
That's weirdly crazier than believing in God. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Kant wouldn't agree with me, but I think so.
Right. I mean, but if I'm not mistaken, it was the humor. It was the humor Daniel. I can't remember. another one of the great four horsemen of the atheist. They've come to the conclusion that it must be directed by, must be deposited from panspermia, right? Because again, they've come to realize, they've come to realize that the period of time is just not long enough. And what's the only other recourse? God or outer space, right?
And you're saying the problem is that the time really was longer, but we're so locked into the whole dating of the Big Bang and whatnot that we can't see that. Am I right?
Sort of, kinda, right? I mean, sort of, kinda, right? I believe fully in the efficacy of natural selection as a process, but natural selection cannot work alone because it would take too much time to does that make sense to you, Robin? Right. So, and Darwin knew that it took a long time. Darwin posited that he had almost unlimited amounts of time. Well, now we know that not to be true.
Okay, I see what you're saying. That's a good clarification because I somehow got that flipped around. And okay, so you're saying in your paper that that's why saltation is necessary. It's a necessary addition to evolutionary theory because
Addition, exactly. You got it right.
right, because there's not enough time for what Darwin posits, his gradualism, to have developed, you know, I mean, but you know, the very little, I did take one whole course on biological evolution in undergraduate school. I absolutely loved it. And what I loved about it was that my professor made us write like a little 5-page paper every week that was like just reflective about what we had read and talked about in class that week. I learned so much, and I was a very committed evangelical Christian at the time. And to my absolute shock, well, this was, you know, in 1979 or 1980, maybe, I came out of that course a profound belief in evolution, a believer in evolution. So that was a great experience for me. But oh, damn it, now I've lost my train of thought because I tangentialized about my own life. Let me think about what I wanted to say to you. I don't remember. When it comes back to me, I'll interrupt again. Keep going. Keep talking.
I think.
Can I ask a quick question, or can
ahead,
I give you guys a quick?
Absolutely.
I gotta go in the next minute because of my son, because I've been out here for longer than I expected. But
it's all good.
I emailed the whole group about the Anthony Flew thing only because I've corresponded with Gary Habermas so much. And a few weeks ago, I literally brought up Anthony Flew because we were talking about philosophy of religion. And I teach that to my students. And I said, oh, yeah, he's a deist. And he quickly corrected me and said, no, he's a theist. I said, oh. So he says he's kicking my chair. He knew Flew personally for 20 years, and they were actually good friends. And he interviewed him, a series of interviews. So I sent it to you, the last one that they did.
Thank you.
Where he's claiming Flew is indeed a theist. And he quickly corrected me. And I was like, I didn't know that. I thought he was a deist. Meaning God's not personal. God doesn't interact with humanity, but I send that to you. You guys can review it and give me your thoughts. But this is fascinating. I wanted to make one more comment, Brad, too. When I was in seminary, we had to take philosophy of science, and it was hard to say the least, but we had to go into realist, anti-realist theories. And it got really technical, and we pretty much the position there from most of the philosophers, they believe that it's an old earth, but they did invite a PhDer that got his dissertation in the astrophysics of the sun. The guy was well versed in physics. Imagine when you're an astrophysicist, he was a young earther. So he had different problems in the cosmos that I've never even heard of. Redshift, I don't know. I forget the exact technical terms. So anyways, thought it was fascinating. But just to let you know, there are seminaries out there that are on the cutting edge of providing both sides of the debates, and they're not closed-minded to either view. And we had to learn philosophy of science before we could even appreciate those, but we were taught not to divide over the age of the earth. Meaning that if you believe God exists, There are views that, you know, you can take theistic evolution, or you can reject evolution and still believe that God exists, but, you know, not to divide over the age of the earth kind of thing. That's where I lean now. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there.
I think you're getting tugged on there by little members.
Dude, my son is like a rugby player underneath my chair. Sorry.
We get it. No, we're a kid-friendly dissertation group.
Okay.
I just wanted to also say before you leave us, Joseph, that John and I took a class from Ingolf Dalforth, you know, from our PRT program. Wasn't it 2019, John? That
I don't know which class.
it was his analytical philosophy of religion class, and
Cool.
and I only found out later that the materials that he gave us were what he himself had written his dissertation on many hundreds of years ago. But it was the whole thing, beginning with flu, of, you know, the quest to prove the existence of God and all the debates surrounding that in English analytical philosophy, and not English language, but English as in British analytical philosophy. So do you remember, John, that we read a good bit of flu
Yeah.
and discussed flu a lot? So but I don't remember very much of it, except that if I had been pressed about it, I too, like you, Joseph, would have said, no, I think flu became a deist instead of a theist.
Well,
So
the
I'll be
famous
fascinated
interview.
to look at what you sent us. Yeah.
No, I agree. And the famous interview happened in 2004. Now, there might be articles before that came out that proved it too. And I'm like, I haven't even read this whole thing. I just know that when Habermas corrected me, because I know he's an authority in certain areas. But I mean, when you're saying I didn't know he's a friend with flu at all. They said their wives knew each other. I'm like, okay, yeah, you guys are definitely friends. And then their wives both died around the same time. And I thought, whoa. So
Wow.
in that sense, I thought, okay, maybe I really got to look into this. So when you talk about the dating of Ingolf's research, it could be that shit was dated a long time before that 2004 date. That's the only thing I'm thinking.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, because what we were reading was, it spanned from the early 20th century to around the time that flu died. So
Okay. I
it
didn't
was
mean to get off on a sidetrack.
History. We were doing history of philosophy, you know,
Okay,
of the need to verify God's existence.
See you, Joseph.
See you
We're
guys.
so happy you came today. We just love you for it. And Joseph, why don't you write us a paper about Anthony Flew? We'd really like that.
Oh man, well, you know, maybe if I have something original to say,
or reuse some of your other papers you've already done, portfolio papers.
Actually, I
Maybe.
don't suggest that, John, but I can't be the policeman, but I like to encourage everybody to try to present work that it's current for them. So, or come back and give us more versions of your dissertation, whatever you want to do. We just absolutely love it. Okay.
Okay. Thanks for presenting, Bradford. Nice seeing you guys.
See you, Joseph.
Bye, Joseph.
So sorry, Brad. I had to kind of jump off there for a bit, so I hope I didn't miss anything. But I do really look forward to, you know, your engagement of this question that Philip Clayton is asking you, because you know, when Clayton first came to CST, he had a dual appointment with CGU, and this was about a year or so before I came, and so I took philosophy of science with Clayton in like 2004 or something like that. And of course I did it in the undergrad too. And this was always the kind of the burning question that I always never really got any clarity from him, you know, about how these, to use the kind of Wittgensteinian term of language games in the kind of common way in which it's understood. I never really understood how Clayton was seeing these kinds of disparate projects come together. Like, you know, he had us read, God, I forget the name of the books, but there was a guy writing about physics. There was a guy writing about the brain, or the structure of the brain. all of which was incredibly fascinating. Brian Greene, his book on string theory, that's what it was. And I always felt like Clayton was searching
You got a
for,
good memory.
yeah, I always felt like Clayton was searching for some kind of string theory, but theologically, right? And I've always been just kind of curious about that project in general, right? So I'm really fascinated to see, where you're going to come, because it come down, because you have such a clear handle on this content. It's really interesting. I learned a lot today. And I also appreciate your comment, right, about the charlatans, because that's true. That's true, right? They're pervasive, and they have real world impacts, right, on how people, whatever. So I heard that kind of personal existential kind of response, which I wanted to note, as something that I appreciated as well. So that's why I asked that question. So
Gotcha. All right, bud.
I have a meeting with somebody shortly
Yeah.
at 4:15 that I have to get in my car and go to. But I had something outside of this topic today that I wanted to bring up to the three of you. There is an official announcement that CST is not leaving Claremont, though.
What?
Yeah, just listen, they're actually going to maintain a two campuses, one in Oregon and one at Claremont,
Oh my God.
because they didn't win the lawsuit. The court ruled that basically, because of the long time ago agreement that if they left, they would have to sell the property back to the consortium at a very low cost, that lawsuit apparently is such that CST can't leave Claremont because they can't sell the property for what they
Wow.
need to sell it for. So Quan, the president, the administration, he's planning to, from what I can see, I sent you an email, Robin.
I can't believe this.
So CST is staying in some sense. The administration of CST apparently is staying here in Claremont. And it's going to maintain a dual campus situation. Oregon, as well as Claremont.
You know
Can
anything
you-
about that, Brad?
He's right. Can you end the recording now?
Oh, sure.
Oh,